Judge Maya Roberts shattered barriers to become the first black female judge in Asheville. But when a veteran cop openly defied her authority in court, Maya found herself facing not just prejudice, but also dangerous threats against her family. Can she hold on to justice while protecting those she loves? This story isn't just about justice. It's about courage and resilience in the face of adversity. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments and share your thoughts. And if you're inspired by stories like this, make sure to like and follow our channel for more. Now let's dive into the powerful journey of Judge Maya Roberts. Maya Roberts grew up in a world where the odds were never in her favor. As a young black girl in Asheville, she often walked past shops where signs didn't need words to send a message. You don't belong here. Her mother's voice was a constant in her life. Maya, you'll have to fight twice as hard to get half as far. Those words became her compass, igniting a fire within her. A dream to bring justice to a community that had been overlooked and ignored for far too long. Her journey was anything but easy. Law school was a battlefield, where whispers of doubt and outright prejudice tried to undermine her every step. She endured sleepless nights and endless rejection, but Maya refused to be silenced. She wasn't just fighting for a seat at the table. She was building the table for others to join. Becoming the first black female judge in Asheville wasn't just a personal victory. It was a beacon of hope for those who had never seen someone like them hold such power. That day in the courtroom, Maya entered with the same quiet strength that had carried her through every obstacle. Her black robe, flowing behind her, was more than a uniform, it was her shield. The room fell silent as she stepped inside. Every pair of eyes was on her, some filled with admiration, others with skepticism, and a few with thinly veiled hostility. She met them all with a steady gaze, her chin lifted, her stride unwavering. But deep inside, she couldn't ignore the weight pressing on her chest. She had faced prejudice her entire life, yet it never felt lighter. Each day on the bench was another battle, not just to uphold the law, but to prove that she belonged there. Maya knew she carried the hopes of an entire community on her shoulders, and failure was not an option. As she scanned the room, her eyes briefly met a figure standing in the back, Deputy Linda Parker. Arms crossed, her gaze cold and calculating, Linda's very presence felt like a challenge. Maya could sense it immediately. This wouldn't be a typical day in court. Something was coming, and Maya would need every ounce of her strength to face it. She took her seat, the courtroom settling into a tense stillness. For a moment, she allowed herself a deep breath, grounding her resolve. On the surface, she exuded authority and calm, but in her mind, a single question echoed. How far will I need to go to prove that justice is stronger than hate? Linda Parker had spent over 2 decades on the force, earning a reputation as a fearless, no-nonsense officer. Her peers respected her work ethic, her superiors valued her discipline, and rookies learned quickly not to cross her. She was known as Iron Linda, a nickname she wore with pride. But beneath the polished badge and the stoic demeanor lay something darker, resentment. To Linda, the world had a natural order, and people like Maya Roberts didn't belong at the top of it. In her eyes, Maya's rise to the bench wasn't a testament to progress, but a sign that things were slipping out of control. The first black female judge in Asheville? To Linda, that was a disruption, a crack in the foundation of a system she believed should never have changed. When Linda entered the courtroom that day, she made sure every step of her boots echoed on the tiled floor. She wasn't just walking, she was announcing herself. Her sharp gaze swept across the room, lingering for a moment on Judge Roberts. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and unapologetically defiant. She didn't need words to make her feelings clear. I don't recognize your authority, and I never will. Her stance was rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Linda didn't sit, she loomed. Her presence alone carried an unspoken challenge to anyone who dared question her convictions. When her name was called, she delayed for a moment, letting the silence grow heavy. Then slowly she smirked, a smirk that dared the room to push her limits. To Linda, this wasn't Maya's courtroom. It was hers, and she intended to prove it. But Linda's defiance wasn't just about Maya. It was about what Maya represented: change. Linda saw the cracks forming in the walls she had spent her life upholding, and she was determined to stop them from spreading. As she stood there, her thoughts were clear. This bench doesn't belong to Maya Roberts. Not today. Not ever. The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that wraps around you, making even the smallest sound feel amplified. Judge Maya Roberts sat tall on the bench, her black robe flowing like armor as she surveyed the room. With a calm but commanding tone, she said, "Deputy Parker, please approach the stand." Linda Parker didn't budge. Her arms remained tightly crossed over her chest, her feet planted firmly on the ground. The tension in the air grew thicker as the seconds stretched. Finally, she spoke, her words sharp and deliberate, slicing through the silence. "No, I'm not taking orders from her." The room froze. Gasps rippled through the crowd like the first drops of rain before a storm. All eyes darted between Linda and Judge Roberts. The court stenographer, who rarely lifted her eyes from the keys, paused midair, her gaze wide with disbelief. Even the bailiff, whose expression was usually unreadable, shifted uneasily on his feet, glancing between the two women. Maya lowered the papers in her hand, her movements deliberate and measured, her gaze locked onto Linda's, steady and unwavering. "Excuse me, Deputy Parker?" she asked, her tone sharp yet composed. It wasn't just a question, it was a warning. Linda smirked, tilting her head slightly. Her voice, dripping with disdain, echoed through the room. "I said no. I don't answer to people like you." The phrase hung in the air, heavy and venomous. The words "people like you" weren't just disrespectful. They were a challenge. They carried a weight that pressed down on everyone in the room. The jury exchanged uneasy glances, the attorneys sat motionless, and the spectators in the gallery leaned forward, captivated by the unfolding confrontation. Maya's fingers tightened briefly on the armrests of her chair, but her expression never wavered. She had faced words like this before, words meant to cut, to diminish. But this wasn't the time to let emotions take over. Maya straightened her shoulders and leaned forward slightly, her voice firm and unyielding. "Deputy Parker, this is a court of law, not a platform for personal grievances. Either comply with the court's orders, or you will be removed from this courtroom." Linda's smirk widened, her defiance unshaken. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, the sound of her boots striking the floor echoing in the room. "Do what you need to, Judge," she said, her tone laced with mockery. "But I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, it felt as if the room itself was holding its breath. Maya didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, her authority unshaken. "Bailiff," she said, her voice cold and sharp as a blade, "escort Deputy Parker out until she is ready to respect the authority of this court." The bailiff hesitated briefly, then moved forward. Linda stood her ground, her eyes blazing with defiance, but she didn't resist as she was led away. The sound of her boots faded as the door closed behind her, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Maya inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, but she refused to let it show. This wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about sending a message. And as she glanced around the courtroom, her eyes met the nervous faces of the jury and the crowd. She knew this was far from over. Linda Parker wasn't the type to back down. And Maya wasn't the type to give in. The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that prickled at the edges of nerves. Judge Maya Roberts sat tall on the bench, her calm composure a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the room. Her voice, steady and deliberate, broke the tension. "Deputy Parker, I am warning you for the last time. This behavior will not be tolerated in my courtroom." Her words carried weight, slicing through the air with precision. She held Linda Parker's gaze, unyielding and sharp. The defiance in Linda's eyes was unmistakable, but Maya didn't flinch. This wasn't the first time she'd faced someone unwilling to respect her authority, but it was the first time it had been so blatant, and in her courtroom. Linda's smirk deepened, her arms still firmly crossed over her chest. "Do what you have to, Judge," she said, her tone laced with mockery. "But I'm not going anywhere." The crowd seemed to hold its breath. Gasps had already rippled through the room earlier, but now an uneasy murmur began to rise. Maya felt the weight of every eye in the room, some watching in doubt, others waiting to see how she would assert herself. Her grip on the armrests of her chair tightened for just a moment before she released them, her expression steady and unreadable. She knew this moment wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about sending a message. The authority of the court wasn't up for debate. Maya inhaled deeply, her voice clear and sharp as she spoke. "Deputy Parker, you have crossed a line. This is a court of law, not a stage for personal grievances. If you refuse to comply with the rules of this court, you will leave me no choice but to take action." The room was thick with tension, but Linda's stance remained unchanged. Her smirk didn't falter, and her silence spoke louder than any words. Maya knew this wasn't just about disrespect. Linda's actions were a challenge, a direct assault on everything Maya had worked to build. This wasn't about a single courtroom session. It was about power, about control. Maya turned slightly, addressing the bailiff with calm authority. "This court is adjourned," she said, her tone final. "Chief Collins will be contacted immediately to address this disruption. Until then, this session will not continue." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and Maya could feel the pressure of the moment settling on her shoulders. She rose from her seat, her movements deliberate and composed. Her black robe swayed behind her as she descended the bench. She walked past Linda without a glance, her steps steady and resolute. As Maya exited the courtroom, she allowed herself a brief pause in the quiet hallway. The knot of tension in her chest hadn't eased. If anything, it had tightened. Linda Parker wasn't just testing her today. This was a beginning, and Maya knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. The courtroom was quieter now, but the tension lingered like a storm waiting to break. James Carter, a young black man with tired eyes, stood nervously at the witness stand. His hands gripped the edge of the podium, knuckles white as he glanced at the people in the room. For a moment, it seemed as though the words he needed were trapped in his throat. Judge Maya Roberts gave him a reassuring nod from the bench, her calm gaze urging him to continue. Finally, James inhaled deeply, his voice trembling as he began. "It happened a few months ago. I was driving home from work, late shift at the factory, when she pulled me over." He glanced briefly toward Linda Parker, who sat with her arms crossed, her expression cold and unmoved. She called me a thug," James continued, his voice cracking slightly. "She told me I didn't belong in her neighborhood. I tried to explain. I wasn't speeding, wasn't breaking any laws, but she wouldn't listen. She said she could smell trouble just by looking at me." The room felt heavier with every word. James's gaze dropped to the floor as his hands tightened their grip on the podium. "She twisted my arm," he said, his voice now barely above a whisper. "I wasn't resisting, but she kept doing it. Then she threw me against the hood of the car and said I needed to learn my place." James's voice faltered, and he stopped. His chest rose and fell as he struggled to collect himself. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even those who might have dismissed his story before now sat in stunned quiet. Maya leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but steady. "Take your time, Mr. Carter," she said. James nodded, swallowing hard. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with tears. His voice was raw as he spoke again. "I just wanted to get home. I just wanted to be treated like a person." His words hung in the air, piercing through the walls of indifference and disbelief. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces marked by a mix of guilt and empathy. Even the court stenographer seemed momentarily frozen, her fingers hovering above the keys. As the courtroom absorbed James's testimony, Chief David Collins, seated quietly near the back, furrowed his brow. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, but his mind raced. James's story wasn't new to him. Complaints about Linda Parker's behavior had surfaced before. But something about this case felt different. As James described the language Linda had used, a pattern began to form in Collins's mind. It wasn't just prejudice. It was organized, coordinated. After the session ended, Collins leaned toward one of his officers, his voice low. "Look into her, deeply. I want to know if she's connected to anything bigger." His tone was clipped, laced with urgency. He had seen enough signs to suspect that Linda wasn't acting alone. As he watched James exit the courtroom, Shoulders slumped but head held high, Collins felt a knot tighten in his chest. This wasn't just about one officer's misconduct. It was about uncovering something far darker, a system of hate operating under the surface. And Linda Parker, he suspected, was just the beginning. The first message arrived late at night. Maya was at her desk, the soft glow of her laptop casting long shadows across her office. The words on the screen were cold, sharp, and filled with venom. "You don't belong here. Leave, or you'll regret it." Maya stared at the message, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. Her heart raced, but her expression remained composed. This wasn't the first time she'd been reminded that her presence on the bench wasn't welcome by everyone. But there was something different about this, something that made the air in the room feel heavier. Another message arrived the next morning. This one was worse. The language was hateful, the threats more explicit. Maya sat in her car outside the courthouse, her phone clenched tightly in her hand as she read the words over and over. "If you don't step down, we'll make you." For the first time in a long while, Maya felt her confidence waver. Her chest tightened and she inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. The weight of her decisions, the cases she'd presided over, the people she'd fought to protect, pressed against her like a tidal wave. But she couldn't let fear win. Not now. Not ever. That evening, as Maya worked late in her home office, she noticed something unusual. The soft hum of an engine reached her ears, faint but persistent. She stood, moving slowly to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer outside. A black SUV sat parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, its engine idling quietly. It hadn't been there earlier. Maya's breath caught. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the vehicle. It didn't belong to anyone on her street. She was certain of that. The house was quiet, but the tension in her chest was deafening. She watched for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the car to move. But it didn't. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, the faintest flicker of worry in her eyes. For all her strength and composure, Maya couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone was watching. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the curtain as she whispered to herself, "You won't scare me." The SUV finally pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. Maya released the curtain and exhaled shakily. But the knot in her stomach remained. She turned back to her desk, her mind racing with questions. Who was behind the threats, and how far were they willing to go? The night was calm, deceptively so. Maya sat at the dining table, her focus on the documents spread before her. The soft glow of the overhead light cast shadows that stretched across the room. Ethan was in the kitchen, tidying up after dinner, while Sophie worked quietly in her bedroom upstairs. It was an ordinary evening, until it wasn't. A deafening crash shattered the stillness. Glass exploded inward as a firebomb tore through the living room window. Flames erupted instantly, devouring the curtains and licking hungrily at the walls. The acrid stench of smoke filled the air, and for a moment, everything froze. Then chaos erupted. "Maya!" Ethan's voice rang out from the kitchen as he sprinted toward her. Maya was already on her feet, her instincts taking over. Grabbing her phone, she quickly dialed 911, her voice trembling but controlled as she shouted, "There's a fire! Get Sophie!" Ethan dashed upstairs as Maya turned to the living room, her heart pounding. The flames were spreading quickly, their heat pressing against her like an invisible force. She grabbed a blanket from the couch and tried to smother the fire near the window, but it was futile. The blaze was too strong. A cry pierced through the chaos. "Mom!" Sophie stood at the top of the stairs, her small frame trembling. Her wide, tear-filled eyes reflected the flickering orange glow of the flames below. "What's happening?" she whimpered. Maya dropped the blanket and ran to the stairs, scooping Sophie into her arms. The child clung to her tightly, her entire body shaking as she buried her face in her mother's shoulder. "Mẹ!" Sophie sobbed, slipping into the Vietnamese word for mom in her fear. "Con sợ." Maya held her daughter close, her own tears threatening to fall. But her voice remained steady, unwavering. "Mẹ hứa sẽ bảo vệ con," she said softly, kissing Sophie's forehead. "Không sao đâu, con yêu, mẹ trong tim em." Ethan reappeared, a fire extinguisher in his hands. He worked quickly, spraying foam at the base of the flames. "Get outside," he shouted over his shoulder. "I'll handle this." Maya nodded and rushed to the back door, guiding Sophie through the thickening smoke. The cool night air hit them as she slid the door open, and they stepped outside. Sophie clung to her mother, sobbing quietly as Maya scanned the dark street for any sign of the attacker. In the distance, the wail of sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights lit up the neighborhood as fire trucks and police cars arrived. Neighbors gathered on their porches, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange glow from Maya's burning living room. Maya stood firm, her arms wrapped protectively around Sophie. The adrenaline coursing through her body made her hands shake, but her resolve didn't falter. Her home could be rebuilt, but her family's safety was her only concern now. As firefighters worked to extinguish the flames and officers began asking questions, Maya's thoughts were racing. This wasn't just an act of hate, it was a message, a warning. But as she looked down at Sophie, who had finally calmed in her arms, Maya whispered to herself, "You will not scare us. Not tonight. Not ever." The morning after the attack, the scent of smoke still lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the night before. Maya sat at the kitchen table, her hands resting on the cool surface. Ethan watched her from the doorway, his eyes filled with worry. "You don't have to do this, Maya," he said softly. "We can step back, focus on keeping Sophie safe." Maya lifted her gaze, her face resolute despite the heaviness in her chest. "If I step back, they win," she replied, her voice firm. "And I'm not letting that happen. Not for me, not for Sophie." Ethan nodded, the conflict in his expression clear. "Then we do this together," he said. Later that morning, Maya met Chief David Collins at the police station. The small conference room was filled with evidence from the firebomb attack. Photos of the damaged living room, fragments of the shattered bottle, and reports from investigators. Collins leaned forward, his fingers steepled under his chin. "This attack wasn't just an act of hate," he began. "It was a warning. They're trying to scare you into silence." Maya's jaw tightened, but she refused to let her fear show. "Who's behind it?" she asked, her voice calm but insistent. Collins exhaled, a grim expression on his face. "We've traced some leads," he said. "Linda Parker's involvement is clear, but it's bigger than her. We suspect she's tied to an extremist group. We're digging into their communications and financial activity now." The mention of Linda's name sent a flicker of anger through Maya, but she kept her focus sharp. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Collins raised an eyebrow, surprised by her composure. "You don't have to get involved," he said. "If you stay out of this, it might lower the heat on you and your family." Maya shook her head. "Staying out of it won't make us safer. They've already attacked my home, my family. I'm in this fight whether I want to be or not, so tell me what I can do." Collins studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "We'll work together. But you need to understand, the deeper we dig, the more dangerous this gets." Maya's eyes didn't waver. "Let them come," she said quietly. "I won't let fear dictate how I live." That evening, as Maya returned home, she found Sophie drawing at the kitchen table. The sight of her daughter's small, focused face brought a moment of calm to her otherwise chaotic day. Sophie looked up as Maya approached, her expression curious but serious. "Mom, did they find the bad people?" Sophie asked. Maya knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from Sophie's face. "Not yet," she said, "but we're working on it. I'm helping Chief Collins make sure they can't hurt anyone else." Sophie hesitated, then reached for her mother's hand. "Are you scared?" she asked softly. Maya smiled faintly, her voice steady. "A little," she admitted. "But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going, even when you are." Sophie nodded, her small hand slipping into Maya's. In that moment, Maya felt a renewed strength. The fight ahead was daunting, but she wasn't backing down. She couldn't, not for herself, and not for the future she wanted for her daughter. The operation unfolded in the quiet hours of the morning. Flashing red and blue lights lit up the streets as officers surrounded a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of town. Chief David Collins stood near the command vehicle, his jaw set in determination. Inside, They knew Linda Parker and Mark Reed, the leader of the extremist group, were planning their next move. But this time, the law had arrived first. As the SWAT team breached the doors, the crack of boots on the concrete echoed through the still air. Commands were shouted, and resistance was met with swift action. Within moments, Linda and Mark were led out in handcuffs, their faces lit by the harsh glow of police spotlights. The crowd that had gathered watched in stunned silence as the once defiant figures were brought to justice. Linda's gaze scanned the crowd until it landed on Maya, who stood at the edge of the police line. Her expression was a storm of anger and betrayal. The hatred in her eyes burned as she locked onto Maya, her voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't over," she spat. "You think you've won, but you haven't." Maya didn't flinch. Her face remained calm, her eyes steady. She met Linda's venom with an unshakable resolve, her expression speaking louder than any words. Justice doesn't bow to hate. Mark Reed, his shoulders slumped in defeat, was silent as he was loaded into the police van. His presence, once commanding among his followers, now seemed diminished, a man stripped of power and purpose. As Linda was escorted past her, Maya stepped forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "It's over, Linda," she said. "You chose this path, and now you'll face the consequences." Linda didn't respond, but her glare lingered, filled with a bitterness that only deepened as the van doors slammed shut behind her. Maya stood there for a moment, watching the vehicle pull away. She felt a mix of relief and resolve. This was a victory, but it wasn't the end. There was still work to be done, wounds to heal and trust to rebuild. As the crowd began to disperse, a reporter approached Maya, microphone in hand. "Judge Roberts, how do you feel now that they've been arrested?" Maya took a deep breath, glancing at the faces around her. "I feel hopeful," she said simply, "because today proves that hate can be confronted and defeated." Her words hung in the air, resonating with the onlookers. And for the first time in weeks, the tension in her chest began to ease. Justice had taken a step forward. The crowd gathered in the town square, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of string lights strung across the stage. It was a crisp evening, but the air was warm with anticipation. Maya stood at the podium, her black robe flowing gently in the breeze, a stark reminder of the authority she carried and the responsibility it demanded. She took a deep breath, scanning the crowd. There were familiar faces, friends, colleagues, and neighbors, alongside strangers who had come to witness the moment. Her voice, steady and clear, broke the quiet. "Tonight, we celebrate a step forward," she began, her gaze sweeping over the attentive faces. "But let me remind you, justice is not just a privilege, it is a duty we must protect even when it places us in harm's way." The crowd remained silent, hanging on her every word. "It is easy to turn away," Maya continued, her voice gaining strength, "to pretend that hate, discrimination, and fear are someone else's problem. But when we do that, we allow them to grow. We give them power. And when we give them power, we all lose." She paused, her chest rising and falling as she steadied herself. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite it. And tonight, we've shown that fear will not dictate how we live. Not in this town, not in this country. A ripple of applause began, growing louder as her words resonated with the crowd. Maya's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained thoughtful, focused. She leaned forward slightly, her voice quieter but no less powerful. "Justice isn't something we inherit. It's something we create every day, with every choice. So I ask you, what choices will you make? Will you stand up for what's right, even when it's hard? Will you defend those who cannot defend themselves?" The applause swelled, filling the square like a wave of hope and solidarity. Maya stepped back, her gaze still scanning the faces before her. Among the applause, she spotted a young girl near the front, clutching her mother's hand and looking up at Maya with wide, admiring eyes. The sight filled her with a quiet determination. As the applause began to die down, Maya descended the stage. People reached out to shake her hand or offer words of gratitude, but her expression remained composed, her thoughts distant. She smiled politely, exchanging brief pleasantries, but the weight of her work pressed firmly against her shoulders. When she reached the edge of the square, she paused, looking back at the crowd still murmuring with admiration. The faces blurred together, but the energy was clear. Hope, relief, determination. It was a victory, but she knew better than to celebrate too much. The fight wasn't over. It never really was. Maya turned, her black robe trailing behind her as she walked into the night, her steps steady, her resolve stronger than ever. The front door creaked open as Maya stepped inside, the weight of the day still pressing on her shoulders. The house was quiet, bathed in the soft amber glow of the setting sun streaming through the windows. She set her bag down gently, exhaling deeply as she closed the door behind her. Before she could take another step, the sound of small, hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway. Sophie appeared, her face lighting up as she ran to her mother. "Mom," she called, throwing her arms around Maya. Maya knelt to meet her daughter's embrace, holding Sophie tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're my hero." Maya's breath caught for a moment, and she blinked back the tears that threatened to spill. She pulled Sophie closer, her voice steady but soft. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said. "That means everything to me." Ethan appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, leaning casually against the frame, a warm smile on his face. "She's right, you know," he said. "You are a hero, not just to her, but to all of us." Maya stood, still holding Sophie's hand, as Ethan walked over and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No matter what happens next," he said gently, "this family will always have your back." Maya smiled, her expression a mixture of gratitude and quiet determination. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. She looked at both Ethan and Sophie, her resolve shining through. "You're my strength." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Maya stepped outside onto the porch. The cool evening breeze brushed against her face as she leaned lightly on the wooden railing. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment to simply breathe. The world around her felt calm, but she knew this was only a brief reprieve. The battle for justice wasn't over. It never really was. Yet, in this quiet moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Inside the house, Sophie's laughter echoed faintly, mixing with the rustling leaves in the evening air. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. When she opened them, her gaze fell on the horizon, her lips curving into a small, contented smile. Bathed in the soft golden light of the sunset, Maya stood as a symbol of resilience, strength, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of a brighter tomorrow. Thank you for watching this story of resilience, courage, and justice. If it inspired you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more meaningful stories. Your support fuels our passion to create quality content that uplifts and motivates. Together, we can continue sharing stories that make a difference. Thank you for being a part of this journey.